I'm sure many of the viewers of this channel usually play Puckdoku. It's this new puzzle game that has kind of taken the sports world by storm. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. You have different categories and you try and name a player that fits both categories. For instance, in today's Puckdoku, you have to name a player that played for both the Calgary Flames and the St. Louis Blues. And you can see that I picked Joey Mullen. There are other categories that aren't just teams, like Stanley Cup champion or played in 1,000+ career games. I wanted to make a video for fun, and just because I like this Puckdoku idea so much, I wanted to penguinify it as I do. And I wanted to go over all 32 teams and what I think are some of the best Puckdoku answers for the Pittsburgh Penguins. You'll see where I'm going with this video in a couple seconds once we get started. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all 32 NHL teams and name Penguins players that fit. Let's start with the obvious players for all 32 teams. Now, I want to lay a ground rule at the beginning of this for all 4 of the categories that I do. No duplicate players. However, there are a couple players that are kind of larger than life. If you get Penguins on your Puckdoku and you get any of the following teams, you have an easy answer with these 4 players. Phil Kessel, Paul Coffey, Marc-Andre Fleury, and the king of Puckdoku himself, Jaromir Jagr. Those 4 players alone give you all of these answers. I'm not going to be using those players as the obvious answers. And because of that, some of these teams just won't have an obvious answer that I think everyone will get. So I'm going to bounce around here in which order I go through teams, because I'm going to go with what I think are the strongest and most obvious multiple teams played for the Penguins, played for another team candidates. Here are a couple obvious ones that I think everyone should get if they get Penguins and this other team on Puckdoku. Patrick Hornquist with the Predators, Tom Barrasso with the Sabres, Erik Karlsson with the Senators, Patrick Marleau with the San Jose Sharks, Luc Robitaille with the LA Kings, that did happen, Jerome Iginla with the Calgary Flames, Ron Francis with the Hartford Whalers / Carolina Hurricanes, and Marian Hossa with the Chicago Blackhawks. All of these players I consider all-time greats for either one of these franchises or that franchise and the Penguins as well. There are no wrong answers here as long as I get the teams right. So these are just, again, these are just my picks on who I think are the obvious answers for these teams for Puckdoku. So I think all of these are safe picks. Like Hossa is obviously a legend in Chicago, not necessarily Pittsburgh. Robitaille with the Kings, things like that. Also Marcus Naslund with the Vancouver Canucks, Mark Recchi with the Montreal Canadiens, Bill Guerin with the New Jersey Devils, Brian Trottier with the New York Islanders, Sergei Zubov with the Dallas Stars, that did happen. I know Larry Murphy could be used for a couple teams, but I'm going to use him for the Detroit Red Wings. And that kind of concludes what I think are the top big franchise name players for both teams. Now I want to go over a couple recent players that fit the bill, and because they're fresh in everyone's mind, they're kind of more obvious to the general public. Those are Riley Smith with the Vegas Golden Knights. I didn't choose Fleury for that. Brandon Tanev with the Winnipeg Jets, Jason Zucker with the Arizona Coyotes, Rickard Rakell with the Anaheim Ducks, Brian Dumoulin with the Seattle Kraken, Carl Hagelin with the Washington Capitals, Jack Johnson with the Columbus Blue Jackets, and David Perron with the St. Louis Blues. You remember when he played for the Penguins? I think all of these picks kind of still solidify players that are really kind of iconic with at least one of these franchises. And then you can also say, oh, he played for the Penguins, or oh, he did play for this other team. The remainder of my picks for the obvious answers aren't obvious, though, unless, of course, I'm using Jagr, Coffey, Fleury, or Kessel, or even Mark Recchi. I'm going to fill out the remainder of the board with answers that I think I typically use for these teams. These aren't necessarily the obvious answer because, again, I don't want to use multiple players. So they are Alexei Kovalev with the Florida Panthers, Rick Tocchet with the Flyers, Max Talbot with the Colorado Avalanche, Ryan Malone with the Tampa Bay Lightning. I don't know why I forgot Kessel's name here, because he's probably the most obvious Maple Leaf / Penguin. Because we've used guys like Barrasso, Kessel, Murphy, and Ron Francis elsewhere, I'm going to go with Tim Horton for my Penguins Leafs pick. If you're not familiar with hockey history, yes, Tim Horton was a person, and he played hockey, and that's what the Coffey's named after. He was a really good player back in the day. Because I can't use Paul Coffey, I'm going to go with James Neal for my Edmonton pick. And because I can't use Coffey, Kessel, and Recchi again with the Boston Bruins, I'm going to go with Kevin Stevens. I'm going to use Alex Goligoski for my Minnesota Wild pick. Go check out his trade tree. And last but not least, for the Rangers, because I can't use Jagr, Zubov, Robitaille, and Kovalev, I'm going to go with Andy Bathgate, another old-timer here. One of the Penguins' first ever superstars as well, Hockey Hall of Famer as well. So there are my picks for what I think are obvious answers and good solid answers you can use for Puckdoku. If you don't know the answers to this one, use one of these players. It's your safe bet. Now I want to get into the obscure ones, because for those of you that don't know, the more obscure players that you use in a Puckdoku or an Immaculate Grid, the more points you get. This is where we have a little bit of fun, because I'm going to go over two categories. One, players that are kind of obscure that I grew up watching, and two, players I have never heard of in my entire life and I found them on Hockey Reference. For those players, I will not be saying anything other than writing their name on the board because I don't know anything about them. These are the players, those players that I just mentioned, are your real money winners for Puckdoku. For the Avalanche, I have Nate Gennin. I'm going to mispronounce some of these names. I remember he was a defenseman when the Penguins were winning the Cup in 2009. For my obscure player I've never heard of, I have Alain Lemieux. For my Blackhawks player, I have Rob Klinkhammer, who I don't know if you guys remember him. What a stud. He came over again from the Oilers, I think, scored in like his first game and left. And my obscure player I've never heard of, I have Ed Van Imp. For the Blue Jackets, I have Taylor Chorney, who's a youngish defenseman when the Penguins were losing to the Rangers in those consecutive playoff series. And then I have Ryan Craig, who it might be the same Ryan Craig that's a Golden Knights coach right now. I don't know. I have to double check on that. For the Blues, I have Lars Eller, who was drafted by the Blues before he went on to Montreal, then Washington, then here. Kind of a more mainstream pick. He's kind of a bigger name than Nate Gennin. But I thought it was obscure because he played like 30 games for the Blues, and he's like at 30 games with us right now, too. Player I've never heard of, Mickey Dupoint. Another depth defenseman for the Penguins. We have David Warsofsky for the Bruins. And I went with Bob Stewart for the Bruins. Just some guy. Continuing on the path of depth defensemen, do you guys remember when Yannick Weber played for the Penguins for that, like, one game? And who can forget Penguins and Canadiens legend, Perry Ganscher. Evgeny Malkin has had many line mates over the years, but none will be as great as Jason Megna. That was an experiment. Wilkes-Barre guy comes up, plays for both the Penguins and the Canucks. Jim Wiley. Yet another depth defenseman for the Penguins. Steven Oleski. He came in. He was a Cup year player too, I believe. 2017-18 maybe? I swear I'm not making these names up. Rick Barry is also a player that played for both the Capitals and the Penguins. And if you put him on Puckdoku, you'll probably get a 0.1% because I've never heard of him and you never have as well. This one's kind of a popular answer, but it's still obscure just due to the amount of games this person played. I'm putting Paul Bissonnette as my pick for the Arizona Coyotes. And Dylan Reese. For the Devils, do you guys remember when the Penguins picked up Stefan Nason off of waivers? He scored that night. And then he didn't score again, and then he was waived, and now he's like on the Sharks or something. Mitch Wilson. It feels like an eternity ago when Dmitry Kulikov was a Penguin, but that was last year. And he played for the Ducks too, so he's my obscure pick there. Rick Jackman is my never heard of pick. Here's a good one. I remember this player simply because of his name. I'm not going to type it all out. Write it all out. We have Pierre-Luc Letranond LeBlond for my Calgary pick. I only remember him because he was a Wilkes-Barre guy coming up and he had 4 last names. Luc Letranond LeBlond, and it could not fit on his jersey. And that was funny. Tom Chorsky probably had an easier time fitting his name on a jersey. For the Flyers, I got Tom Cicito, who kind of like Paul Bissonnette. Many of you guys remember just because of the fights and everything. And when he was in the lineup, he was very impactful. But he didn't play a lot of games for both the Penguins or the Flyers. And who can forget Penguins and Flyers legend, Wayne Hicks. For the Golden Knights, I have to cheat a little bit because I've heard of every single player that has played for both teams. For my sort of obscure during my time pick, I'm putting Derek England, who I was fortunate enough to meet in Las Vegas last year. And then for the obscure pick, I'm also putting a Derek, this one's spelled different, Derek Pouliot, because he played a couple games for the Golden Knights there when they were down a couple defensemen due to injuries. That was my first year covering them, 2021, 2022. Here's a good one. For the Carolina Hurricanes, We have Zach Boychuk, who probably follows you on Twitter. Really experimental Evgeny Malkin line mate there. Just not a very fantastic player, but he's great at social media. We have Steve Dystra. Some of these players I'm sure older audiences would know, but just for me, I've never heard of the players in red. The Penguin legend, Tom Kuhnhackl. One of my buddy's favorite players. Is that how you spell his name? Knuckles. Tom Kuhnhackl. I saw him score a goal live once. Eric Bogunecki. I think that's how you spell it. Moving along to the Winnipeg Jets, I wanted to put Chris Kunitz here because Chris Kunitz did play 2 games for the Atlanta Thrashers back in the day. But I'm sticking with players that were kind of obscure for both teams. So I went with Eric Tangradi, who's still around the Pittsburgh area. And he was at the RMU Celebrity Hockey game. And a guy named Ramsey Abid also played for both the Thrashers / Jets and Penguins. I couldn't really find a really good Kings one. So I went with Brian Boyle, who I did not know played for the Kings. And I feel like Brian Boyle in a couple of years now, even just now already, is kind of a forgotten Penguin. Like, oh yeah, Brian Boyle did play for the Pens. For my other pick, I got Scott Bukestad, who is the uncle of Nick, also a former Penguin. For the Kraken, again, I have to cheat a little bit. I went with Riley Sheahan, because I believe he's done now in Seattle. I mean, he retired. And for my other pick, I'm using Daniel Sprong. Yet another depth defenseman, Cameron Gaunce. And I have Dave Capuano. Another depth defenseman, we have Frank Corrado. A lot of these players I remember. It's just I don't remember much about them. It's just more of a, oh yeah, type thing. I can't really tell you much about how these players played because they only played a handful of games. And Corey Cross for the Leafs. Again, this feels like it was an eternity ago, but I'm using Drake Caggiula as my Oilers pick. That was just last year, people. And a guy named Brad Aitken. This really feels like it was a long time ago. Do you guys remember Colton Sevier? He came over in the Patrick Hornquist trade and didn't do much. Not as much as Penguins and Panthers legend Jeff Toms. For the Predators, we got Harry Zolnierczyk, Joel Bouchard. For the Rangers, Penguins claimed Taylor Pyatt off of waivers that one year. And we had Pronger. Not Chris, though. Sean Pronger. Stanley Cup champion Carter Rowney is my Detroit pick. And Jim from the Shire. His last name is Shires. Here's another good one. Matt Hunwick. I just remember, no offense to Matt if he's watching this video, but I just remember him being terrible in Pittsburgh, and he did not last long. And then, of course, Dom Pittis. Another good one, Brian Gibbons. I remember he was on the top line with Crosby for a good bit when I think Kunitz was hurt or something, and it worked for like 4 or 5 games, and then he was just gone. Jim Kite. This is kind of a more popular pick for the Sharks. I am going Douglas Murray. That was the Penguins' Ray Shero spending spree in 2013 when he got Jokinen, Iginla, Morrow, and Murray. John Jacob. Almost done here. Another player that was just a couple years ago, Taylor Fadoon. John Sim. Last but not least, we have Daniel Winnick. He was a trade deadline acquisition for the Penguins, if I believe. And he also played for the Wild. Final player, Andy Hillibert. So yeah, it's a lot of players here. These are all just players I wanted to put up on the board as guys that are, I don't know, kind of funny to me. Like, oh yeah, they did play for the Penguins in this other team. And these all make for great Puckdoku answers, whether they be black or red, or I'll get you the real good ones because never heard of a single player in the red. Thank you all for watching. Go all play Puckdoku. These are my Puckdoku stats for anyone that's interested. Like, comment, subscribe. Go Pens.